Hi there, everyone. My name is Michelle Walquist, and I'm the Speech Pathology Division Lead here at the Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorders. And today, I'm going to be talking to you about autism and language development, and hopefully provide you with some strategies for supporting communication, both in younger children all the way up into adolescence. It's a very broad topic, so I'm going to go pretty quickly because there's a lot of information to cover. And also wanted to let you know that this presentation is actually a recording. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be present at the live conference this year. I had something come up, but if you have any questions during my presentation or afterwards, you can email them to centertraining1@hs.uci.edu. Again, that's centertraining1@hs.uci.edu, and I'd be happy to get back to you and answer any questions you might have. So let's go ahead and jump into our presentation. I don't have any disclosures except that I am an employee here at the Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorders. And our objectives today, hopefully, are to provide you with some ideas and strategies for how to support your child's joint attention and play skills. And we'll talk more about what that is and why that's important. I'm hoping to provide you with some ways that you can use books and shared storytelling to help facilitate language in your children. And then I'm also hoping to provide you with some strategies for supporting conversation skills or more social communication skills with your children. Let's just start with what we know are strengths and weaknesses for how autistic children learn. So we know that the children that are in our lives are very visual learners. So if they can see something, they're more likely to remember it and learn it, versus if they are just hearing information without any visual support in front of them. So anytime we're wanting to teach a skill or make sure that our children are understanding what we're talking about, we want to make sure that we're making it visual for them. So throughout the presentation, I'll be showing you ways to make language more visual to help support learning. Our children are also experiential learners versus observational learners. So they do better in remembering information if they can experience and practice the information themselves versus observing somebody else doing the task or demonstrating the task. And so I always give an example of a playground. So if you had a neurotypical child who was watching peers go up and down the slide, and they saw a peer cut in line to go down the slide. And when that child cut in line, all the other children that were in line start to get upset. Their facial expressions change, their tone of voice changes. They start using words like, "Hey, you cut, that's not fair." A neurotypical child who's just observing this situation will think, when that one child cut in line, everyone else got upset. So, I don't think I'm going to cut in line because the outcome wasn't very good for the particular child who did cut in line. So the neurotypical child is going to observe that event that happened to somebody else, and they're going to learn from that event and think about how they might approach that situation differently if it were them. Children on the autism spectrum are not always aware of kind of the bigger picture, not always aware of those social cues, facial expressions, tone of voice. They tend to be more detail focused. So they may be thinking about how many steps are on the ladder up to the slide versus the social interaction that's going on. So they may miss that opportunity to learn that you shouldn't cut in line because they didn't really observe that component of the interaction between peers. So if we want to make sure to teach them the importance of not cutting the line, we might role play that situation. We might actually practice it and go through the motions of doing it ourselves in order to make sure a child has learned whatever the social rule is. We also know that our children are really fantastic at object knowledge. So they know a lot about space, a lot about dinosaurs, a lot about trains, but they may not be as aware of social knowledge. So how you meet friends, how you make friends, how you keep friends, those kinds of social components of interacting with others. We also know our kids are great at memorizing information, particularly language. So that's why you see our kids are often memorizing lines from movies or cartoons. And our kids are not so great at using language creatively. So one thing we're working on in speech therapy is to help kids be more flexible and more creative in how they use language and how they approach the world. We also know that our kids are much better at learning in routines and things that are familiar versus learning in new situations. But ultimately, what we want to remember is that we all learn best when we're calm and having fun. So if you are trying to teach your child a new skill, new information, if you're getting frustrated or you feel like your child is getting frustrated, then it's time to take a break because your child is not going to remember what it is you're trying to teach them if they're not calm and having fun. So let's talk about just the foundations of communication. When a parent comes into a session, a first session or an evaluation with me, and I ask them, what is it that you're hoping to get out of our sessions together? What I often hear is, I want my child to talk more. I want my child to use longer sentences. I want them to be able to tell me what they did at school today. I want them to be able to have a conversation. Now, those skills are in the area of expressive language, which we'll talk a lot more about a little bit later, and social pragmatic language, which we will also talk about. And you can see they're at the very top of this triangle. But if you go down to the bottom of this triangle, there are some foundational skills that need to be in place before you can get good expressive language or social pragmatic language. Those kind of foundational pieces that have to be in place first are joint attention and social referencing. And then on top of that are play skills. On top of that is receptive language. And then we get expressive language and social pragmatic language. So let's jump forward and let's break down each of these areas. And hopefully I'll be able to provide you with some strategies of how to support your children in each of these. So let's just talk about what joint attention is. Remember, this is at the very bottom of our triangle. So joint attention is basically the use of eye contact. So if I am a child and I find something really interesting, let's say I find this really cool pen, and I want to make sure that my parents also see this very cool pen. What I'm going to do if I have good joint attention is I'm going to look at this cool pen, I'm going to look up at my parent, and then I'm going to look back at the pen to say, hey, did you see this really cool pen? Like, whoa, this is awesome. So that shift in eye contact from the pen to my parent back to the pen is called a 3-point gaze shift. And that's the foundation of joint attention. It's basically, do I use my eye contact to share kind of a social interaction with someone, usually based on something interesting that I've found. And it is the foundation of all communication. So if a child's not using great eye contact to kind of check in and see if a parent is noticing what they're noticing, then they're missing all kinds of language learning opportunities. They're missing their parents' facial expressions. They're missing their parents' gestures when they're communicating. They may not be totally focused on the words their parents are using. So at the very foundation of language is increasing a child's use of eye contact, particularly 3-point gaze shifts, which is a more kind of, or a really social use of eye contact. And you can see here that joint attention develops pretty early in life. So by 9 months of age, children are starting to use these 3-point gaze shifts to say, hey, are you noticing this cool thing I'm noticing? And again, it does not require any verbal language. It just requires eye contact. So let's take a look at this video and see if you can notice when this child is using 3-point gaze shifts. When is she using her joint attention to share focus with her mom? There's one. Did you see that? So she looked at her mom, she looked at her dress, she looked back at her mom. She's even pointing to her dress to show her mom. That's a very social moment, just using eye contact. Keep watching. There's a few more.
Is it your Halloween dress? Your pumpkin dress? You're good, you're good. It's your pocket. Anything in your pocket?
Pocket, back to mom, and then back into the pocket. So she used another 3-point gaze shift. Looking at something on the table, looking back at mom to see if she sees it, looking back at the table. Look, she's even reaching out to mom to see if mom saw that. So those are examples of 3-point gaze shifts and good joint attention. Now, joint attention is something that's often challenging for our kids. So what are we going to do to help figure out and improve joint attention? Let's talk about that. So the first thing we want to do is follow your child's lead. What does that mean? That basically means you want to get down at their level and you want to imitate their actions, their noises, their movements. So you're not asking them to do anything. You're just observing what they are doing and you are going to imitate that. So if your child is sitting, say, in a sandbox and they're picking up sand and they're dropping it, they're picking up sand and they're dropping it. If you're going to follow your child's lead, you're going to sit in the sandbox right next to them. You're not going to ask them to do anything. You're just going to sit next to them, pick up the sand just like they are, and drop it. Pick up the sand and drop it. And surprisingly, what happens is because children aren't used to having adults in their world kind of sit down next to them and do what they're doing, usually adults in their world are telling them what to do rather than imitating what they're doing. They will often shift their eye contact and look at you like, wow, hi, hey, thanks for joining me, right? So they may just shift their eye contact and notice you because it's unusual. They're not used to having adults kind of come down to their level and do what they're doing. So that's a good way just to get kids to sort of notice you, is just to start imitating what they're doing. Another great way to get kids to shift their eye contact is to play anticipatory games like peekaboo or tickle tickle or I'm gonna get you. These are easiest to do with younger children or children that are less verbal. And then using toys that do surprising things like a jack-in-the-box or wind-up toys or bubbles or ball poppers. Those are also really great ways to get kids to shift their eye contact and notice you. So take a look just really quickly at this video and see how many 3-point gaze shifts you see, how much joint attention you see just with the jack-in-the-box. See that with the person behind the camera, nice 3-point gaze shift. There's another one. There's another one.
Oh, ready?
So you get the idea. With a toy that does a surprising thing, you're more likely to get a child to take a look and like check in with you to see if you noticed whatever that surprising thing was. And as soon as they look, you want to react like, oh my gosh, I saw that. That was so cool. Let's try it again. So you want to make the activity fun and engaging in order to motivate your child to continue to want to shift their gaze and look at you. Let's go to the next one. Another great way to improve joint attention is to violate routines. And the easiest kind of verbal routine that we all use is ready, set, go. We won't watch the video, but I'll give you an example with my little piggy here. So the key to violating a routine is you have to set up the routine first. So this routine is just going to be ready, set, go. So I'm going to say ready, set, go. And then he sticks his little tongue out. And hopefully it's unexpected. So the child might laugh, but may not look at me, maybe looking at the object because they're more interested in objects than social engagement, as we know. So then I'm going to do the routine again. Ready, set, go. Oh, he stuck out his tongue. That's so silly. Again, the child may not look at me. They may still be looking at the toy. I'm going to do it maybe one more time. Ready, set, go. Oh, that's so silly. Now, maybe the third or fourth time I do it, I'm going to violate the routine. So now the child is expecting me when I say go to squeeze the pig and have the tongue come out. But this time I'm going to do it differently. So I may hold the pig a little bit off to the side. And I'm going to say, ready, set, and then I'm going to pause. And it's at that pause before saying go that oftentimes a child will then look at you like, hey, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. You did it wrong that time. Like, are you stupid? And it's when they shift their eye contact to look at you, like, why did you do it wrong that time? That you then want to say, go, and then finish the routine. So what a child is learning is if they check in with you and look at you, then they end up getting what it is they want, which is the go part. So that's a great way to work on getting joint attention or 3-point gaze shifts. And again, your child doesn't have to use any language. You just want them to shift their eye contact. As soon as they look at you, you reinforce that look with whatever it is they're wanting to happen. The more exaggerated and silly you can be with your facial expressions or your voice, the more likely you are to pull your child's attention. And just a general note that I like to share with parents is I try and avoid saying, look at me, because when in life do you ever say, look at me, look at me, look at me? It's usually when you're upset or somebody's in trouble. So instead of prompting a child to look at me using those words, I try and use some of these other strategies to get eye contact. And if the child looks, then I praise, like, oh, that was really good looking. I love seeing your eyes. Or if I do need to verbally prompt someone to look at me, then I might say, hey, think about me, or think about me with your eyes. Because that's a less confrontational way to get eye contact than saying, look at me. Okay, so now we've talked about the foundations of language development or joint attention. Let's jump up the pyramid, that very beginning pyramid, to play and talk about play and why that's important. So our good friend, Mr. Rogers, said that play is often talked about as if it were a relief from serious learning. But for children, play is serious learning. Play is really the work of childhood. It's a beautiful quote, and it's very true. So our children's jobs are to play, and it's through play that they learn language. So play and language go hand in hand. As children are playing with toys, they're learning new vocabulary. They're learning concepts such as size and shape and texture. They're learning how to be flexible thinkers. So if they want to play telephone, but they don't have a toy telephone, like if I'm a flexible thinker, I might get a banana, or I might get a block, or I might get a pen and use that as a telephone. That's flexible thinking, and something that can be very challenging for our autistic children, and something we want to work on, pushing them to be a little bit more flexible. We learn how to tell stories while we play. So if we're playing with this fire station and I'm sequencing having the firefighter climb up the ladder, spray the fire, save a puppy dog, and climb down the ladder, that's a sequence or a story. If I put language to that, it can be a really interesting story, right? So just sequencing those play steps are the very beginning of storytelling. Children learn how to solve problems as they're playing. So if they have a circle shape and they're trying to put it in a square hole, but it's not working, a good problem solver and flexible thinker will then try another hole to put the circle shape in. Children who are not so great at problem solving, which is oftentimes our children, will keep trying the same hole and it's not working, and they either get frustrated or they just walk away and move on. So it's through play that we can help kids become better problem solvers, better at coping with frustration, better at developing language to ask for help and assistance. Children also learn how to organize their ideas within play. And we also learn turn taking through play, which is very important for conversation skills later on. Sorry, just a quick little slide here. These are some toys that can be really great to initially engage children with autism in play, and they're sensory-based toys. So pin art, things like light spinners or tops, things that have texture that are squishy or you can pull or bounce, pop tubes. These are all great toys to engage children initially if they don't seem very interested in play at the beginning. What do we do to improve play? Well, the first thing you need to do is observe what your child is interested in playing with. And again, it's usually these sensory-based toys, oftentimes, that they're most interested in at the beginning. And just like improving joint attention, it's kind of the same idea for improving play. You want to imitate what your child is doing. You want to join them in their world. Don't force them to play the way you want to play. Have them play how they want to play and you join in. So an example here, if your child is feeding a doll and that's what they're doing when they're playing, then you can sit down next to them and you can feed a doll. Maybe you do that for a couple minutes, but then you add something different. Maybe you spill the food on the floor and you say, oh no, I spilled the food. And then you wait to see what your child does. Do they then feed the doll and spill the food to add that new idea? Do they maybe help you clean up, pretend to clean up the food, which is a new idea? So we're wanting to imitate or start with where they're at and then slowly introduce new ideas to see if they will follow along and add those new ideas into their play. Showing your child how to play with a toy in a new and different way can be a great idea. So if they're really enjoying banging on pots and pans, then you're going to bang on pots and pans, and then maybe you'll show them how you can make it a hat and how silly that is. Maybe you sneeze and the pot falls off. That's kind of silly too and different. So you're more likely to get your children to try something new if you start with where they're at and then you add something new or unusual or different that's kind of silly or fun. And as adults, I will say it's very difficult sometimes to figure out how to play with a toy. We haven't, most of us haven't sat down and played with toys since we were children. So I often suggest acting out stories from one of your children's favorite books or TV shows. You can think about an experience you had earlier in the day, like going to the park. And then maybe later, if your child is playing with figurines, you can act out going to the park. Those are good ways to sort of generate ideas for how to play without having to work too hard to come up with kind of your own story in your head to act out. Oh, sorry. Something that's really important to keep in mind when we're playing is to avoid asking too many questions. Our kids get bombarded with questions all the time. What color is that? What are you doing? Where did we get that? Those kinds of things. And what ends up happening a lot of the time is because they're getting questions all the time asked to them that they then have to answer, is they tend to learn that the way you engage with people is by asking questions. So what happens, I'll bring my little piggy back, is let's say I'm a child and I know this is a pig, but I also know that the way you interact with people is by asking them questions. So I may go up to my parent and I may say, what is it? When really what I should have said is, look, it's a pig, right? So I've now asked my parent a question to engage socially, but I already knew the answer to the question. So it's not an appropriate way to engage. I should have said, it's a pig. Look, it's a pig. It's pink. It's cool. I like it. It makes noise. So in order to kind of avoid having a child learn that the only way you interact with people is by asking them questions, is we want to try and make more comments when we're interacting with them or when we're playing. So instead of saying, "What is this?" I, as a parent, might say, "Oh, look, this is a car. And oh, it's blue. It looks really fast. I want to race this car." So I've not asked my child any questions. I've simply commented on what I'm seeing. And in those comments, I'm not only modeling to the child how you can engage with other people without using questions, but I'm also modeling new vocabulary like fast or blue, big, small, while the child has something in front of them that's very visual. So they can hear the language, they can see what it is I'm talking about, and that's how we end up learning more complex language. Okay, so now we're going to jump up to the middle of the triangle. So we've talked about joint attention, we've talked about play. Let's talk about receptive language. So receptive language is the ability to listen to what other people are saying to us and to understand what they're saying. And typically in development, receptive language or understanding of language develops before expressive language. So kids usually understand more than they're able to say. What sometimes happens with autistic children is there's a reverse profile, meaning they say more than they understand. So because they're really good at memorizing language, oftentimes we hear them scripting, where they're sort of saying long sentences from a cartoon that they enjoy. They're really good at memorizing that language, but they are not totally understanding what that language actually means. So we want to be really careful when we're working with children to make sure that they're understanding everything that they're saying. So how are we going to support receptive language? Let's just talk about how it develops first. Usually children start understanding single words first, like labels for objects and people and actions that are in their everyday environment. Then they understand concepts like big and little, the order of things. So before you put on your shoes, put on your socks. First, we're going to go to the shoe store, and then we're going to go get ice cream. They understand number concepts. After they start kind of understanding those isolated concepts, they can start following simple directions like come here and sit down. After that, they start being able to follow longer, more complicated directions, like before you leave the table, take 3 bites of carrot and 2 bites of potato. That's a long direction with a lot of pieces to it. And then they start understanding question words like what are you doing, who are you going with, where are you going, when and how questions. And then once a child has kind of good comprehension of all of those kinds of concepts, then they start understanding more abstract language. And this usually starts to develop like around 4 or 5, and then develops all the way into adolescence, just at more complex levels. So being able to understand why questions, and just a little suggestion if your child is struggling to understand why questions. If you understand cause and effect, then you should be able to understand why questions. So this is a visual way to teach this. You notice I have a box here with an arrow that says so and a box here, and then the arrow goes this way and it says because. So one thing happens, the first thing happens, which is the cause. It's raining. And because of this, we go here and the grass is wet. So the cause is it's raining. The effect is the grass is wet. So if I was going to put this in a sentence, I would say it's raining, so the grass is wet. But if I was going to answer a why question, the answer actually starts with the effect and goes backwards to the cause. So if I said, why is the grass wet? You would say the grass is wet because it's raining. So the way I work on this in sessions is I'll come up with pictures that show cause and effect. So it's cold, so you wear a coat. And then I'll make boxes with little arrows that say so and because, and we'll make sure we can put the cards in the right order. What happens first? What happens next? And then I'll ask the why question. Why do you wear a coat? Because it's cold outside. Another kind of more abstract language concept is figurative language. So understanding language that doesn't mean exactly what it says, like you're a couch potato, or this classroom is like a refrigerator. This can be challenging for our kids, this more abstract language, because it really requires flexible thinking. We also, children begin to develop skills in remembering information that they have read or heard. That's like reading comprehension kinds of activities. And we can work on this with our children by helping them create pictures in their mind about something they've read, because remember, our kids are very visual. So if they have to read like 2 or 3 sentences, then I might stop them at each sentence and say, okay, make a picture in your head of what you just read. Describe to me what your picture looks like so that I know you're actually visualizing it. You're making a mental picture. And then let's add the next sentence, add that information to your picture. Let's do the next sentence and add that information to your mental picture. And then I might ask them questions about what they read so that they can reference their mental picture in order to answer those questions. Making word associations can also be a good sort of memory trick. So if they're listening to information, like Thomas went to the beach, they may think, oh, Thomas reminds me of Thomas the Tank Engine. So I'm going to imagine Thomas the Tank Engine is at the beach. And that might be a way to remember who was in the story by creating that association with something they're familiar with. Talking about what you're doing kind of on a daily basis, sort of being the narrator of your own life, is a great way to help children start to understand language a little bit better. So when you're walking to school, when you're making dinner, when you're doing laundry, during bath time, again, you're not going to be asking your child questions. You're going to be making comments like, oh, we're walking to school and it's cold outside. Oh, look, that leaf just fell from the tree. It fell slowly. I'm going to step on that leaf. Oh, it made a crunching sound. Right? So you're just talking about your experiences as you're doing them. A great way to help kids start to understand language, particularly younger children or less verbal children. Giving face-to-face instructions is key to helping our children understand language. So I'm sure we've all had these experiences where you might be in the kitchen making dinner and your child is in the living room and they're watching their iPad, and it's time for them to put their iPad away. So you say, Johnny, time to put your iPad away. And you're in the kitchen telling them that. Does Johnny put the iPad away? Of course he doesn't. Because one, you're only giving him auditory information, right? And remember, our kids are not going to learn just with auditory information, meaning if they hear it, but don't see it, they're not likely to understand it. And we also know our kids are not great at multitasking, right? So if they are looking at an object, remember our kids are object focused, they're looking at an object, particularly a screen or an object that they're very interested in, they are 150% focused on that object. So they are not getting any other information going on in their world. So you're in the kitchen, Johnny has not responded like you wanted them to. So then you're going to raise your voice a little bit and you're going to say, Johnny, put your iPad away and get to the table. Johnny's still 150% focused on the iPad. He's still not processing your auditory information, right? Because he can't see you. All he can see is the iPad. He's not going to do anything. And at this point, you're very frustrated because you're tired of repeating yourself. And so you're going to raise your voice. You may even yell. We all do it sometimes. We're going to say, Johnny, put that iPad away and get to the table. And it's at this point when you have gotten loud enough for your child to kind of recognize, oh, something's going on around me besides this iPad, that your child looks and sees that you're upset. And they have no idea why, because they didn't hear any of the other directions. And that's probably going to lead to a tantrum, right? So my suggestion is, if you're going to give your child instructions, you need to move into their visual space, kind of like this woman is doing. Maybe you don't need to be so close to your child, but you need to move so that they can see you. You need to get down on their level. If they're playing with an iPad or playing with a toy, maybe you just gently put your hand on their hand or gently put your hand on the top of the iPad just to get them to notice that you're there. And then you want to give instructions. You're more likely to get compliance and follow through if you are in their visual space in order to have them finish whatever the direction is you want them to do. Also, giving shorter directions can be helpful. So instead of, go get your shoes and then put them by the front door before you wash your hands for dinner, your child's probably going to maybe do one of those things, but not likely to do all of them. Maybe you just need to say, go get your shoes. And then when your child does that, then you'll say, can you put them by the front door? And then when they've done that, then you can say, go wash your hands for dinner. Allow wait time for your child to understand what you've said. So our children with autism can be a little bit slower at processing or kind of figuring out what's been said to them. So if you ask them a question like what is your Batman character doing? It may take maybe 4 to 5 seconds for that kind of question to sink in. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then they might actually say, oh, he's driving his Batmobile. Now, a lot of us are not used to waiting for a response, right? We ask a question and we usually get the response right away. So what happens if we don't get a response right away? We usually ask again. So what is Batman doing? No response. What is Batman doing? No response. What is Batman doing? And then maybe by the 4th time the child answers because they needed time to actually process your question. You didn't need to repeat it. You just needed to give them a little bit of time. If we don't give our children time to process information, they don't get any faster at it, right? So if you're giving an instruction or asking a question and your child doesn't initially respond, just pause for a second and see if they'll respond. If they don't respond after 4 or 5 seconds, then repeat the question. But they may actually respond. And if they do, the more opportunity you give them that time to think about the answer, to process it, the faster they will get at doing so. Sometimes when you're giving directions, you need to show your child what to do. You need to make the direction visual because they won't be able to complete it unless you show them at least 1 or 2 times first. For our older children, we want to encourage them to ask for help or clarification. So it's okay to not understand what you're supposed to do. And we want to make sure that we support our children in their willingness to ask for help. We also want to make our words visual. So using timers, using first then pictures or picture schedules is a great way to do that. Here's some examples of how you can make your words visual. So if you say dinner's in 5 minutes, a child with autism is going to think that means dinner is never, right? What is 5 minutes? I have no idea what 5 minutes is, but if you show me what 5 minutes is on a timer, then I have a better idea of what you're talking about and less likely to have a tantrum. First then boards are very, very helpful. First, we get our haircut and then we use ice cream, or not use ice cream, then we're going to go get ice cream, or first you do your math and then we can get your iPad. And you can see these are just hand drawn. It doesn't have to be fancy. Another way to make your words very visual is to make or use visual schedules. There are schedules that different apps you can get on your phone. You can also just write them out. Here's a schedule for what you need to do in the morning. First you sleep, then you wake up, then you make your bed, then you eat breakfast, then you brush your teeth. And this is a big visual schedule on a calendar of when, holiday celebrations are going to be. You can put, buses on the day that a child goes to school, and maybe a house on the weekend, so your child knows that that's not a school day. So calendars can be a great way to help your children understand time concepts. I know we're flying through this. We're going to keep going. On top of receptive language, we have expressive language. So this is on our pyramid of how language develops. So expressive language is how we use our words to communicate our ideas. Children express themselves without words very early on. So like we've talked about, children can express themselves using eye contact. They can express themselves using gesture. So pulling people, pushing things away, nodding their head, pointing. They can communicate just through vocalization, like, So I didn't use any words, but you know what means. It means I like something, right? So I didn't use any words, but I did vocalize and communicate with you. Crying, aggression, tantrums, all of those are forms of communication. That is not a child trying to be bad. That is a child trying to communicate something when they can't figure out a more effective way of doing it. When children start learning words, then this is sort of the progression of how it develops. Sometimes children initially learn sign language to communicate. And I always encourage families, if their child is not communicating yet, to use sign language. It's a great way to facilitate or increase the likelihood that your child will develop and use actual words. So don't be afraid of using sign language. Then children will learn single words. They'll start putting 2-word combinations together. Then they'll start putting 3-word combinations together. And once kids have started to put 3-word combinations together, then they start adding grammar. So things like, I have 1 cat, I have 2 cats. So using that plural S. So usually kids don't start using grammar until they at least are using 3-word combinations. Once kids have complete sentences, they start being able to tell stories. So they start putting their sentences together in longer and longer and longer ways. We're not going to have time today to talk about echolalia or augmentative communication, but if you have questions, please email me. These are other ways that children can express themselves. How do we improve expressive language? Well, it's very similar to the way we improve other forms of communication. One is to talk about what you're doing in your daily routines. So again, narrating what you're doing every day. So if it's bath time, you might start by just talking about simple vocabulary words like we're going to wash. I'm using soap. This is shampoo. It has lots of bubbles, right? Just talking about what I'm doing as I'm showing the child what I'm using. So they're hearing language, but also seeing what I'm talking about. Later, you might introduce more complicated words like we're going to scrub our hands, scrub, scrub, scrub. Oh, look at all that lather. Let's feel the temperature. So you can advance your vocabulary, make it more complex as a child's language develops. For younger children, waiting and withholding things until they use language to communicate what they want can be a good way to get children to communicate. So if a child wants some goldfish crackers and you have the bag of goldfish crackers, then you want them to say cracker. And as soon as they do, you might give them a couple. And then if they want more, if they say more, then you give them a couple more. So you're kind of waiting and withholding until they are using language to communicate. The tricky part about waiting and withholding is you have to make sure your child is in a calm and relaxed state, because if they're already frustrated or upset or tired or cranky, then withholding something that they really want may lead to upset. So this strategy is a strategy to use when your child's already kind of in a good good mood, feeling well rested and happy. We also want to use language in short but complete sentences. So, while fixing a car, you might say, I'm turning the wrench. Turn the wrench. Instead of just saying wrench, you say it, wrench. Right? So we're modeling how language should be used using a short but complete sentence while emphasizing the most important words. So I'm turning the wrench. And then I might say to the child, you say, turn wrench, right? So first I've modeled the complete sentence. Then I've asked the child to say a shorter version of that sentence. Let's talk about how we use picture books to expand expressive language. This is one of my favorite things to do and can be pretty easily done anywhere. So we're going to use this book here as an example. This is The Girl and the Bicycle by Mark Pett. And there are no words in this book. It's a wordless picture book. So it's great because children who are reading can't rely on the words that they see on the page. They have to come up with the words on their own. A very kind of beginning activity that I like to do with kids is to just work on building comments. So this is a great way to increase your child's ability to describe. So use adjectives or describing words to talk about things. So this can expand how long their sentences are. how they're able to describe events. It's also kind of the foundation of conversation. So to do this, I often get a little picture card that represents these things. So here's like my picture card that I use with color, and it's just an index card, and I wrote color and I just drew a bunch of colors on it. Here's a little index card. Sorry, oh, there you are. It says size, and I just drew different kinds of sizes on it. Here's one that just has shapes, right? So not a big deal, just hand drawn. But these are the kinds of comments that you can make about things. And I will then say about the picture, let's look at this picture, I'll say, wow, there's a bike. And then what I want the child to do is to add some information, like, it's a big bike. At which point I will say, yes, it is a big bike. It's big and green. So now I've added information. So I said something, the child added some information, and then I added some information on top. We have now built upon the language of the person that spoke before us, which is the very beginning of a conversation. And if the child doesn't automatically build on what I say, then I'll hold my little cue card up. So I'll say, oh, look, there's a bike. And then I might point to a color. And I could say, you could tell me what color it is. And then they might say green bike. And I'll say, yes, it is. That's a really fast green bike. So that's how you work on building comments. You could do that. You don't even have to be looking at books. You can be doing that as you're walking down the street, like, oh, there's a tree. And maybe your child will say it's a tall tree. And you'll say, yes, it is. It's a really tall tree with lots of leaves. So that's the idea of building on comments, making it visual by using your cue cards. As kids get more advanced and have a little bit more language, I like to use picture books to work on getting the main idea of a book, seeing the big picture of a situation. Don't focus on the details. Let's zoom out and talk about the main idea. So to do that, I also use these little cue cards. These are actually pictures of the cue cards that I use. And it's who, what, doing, and where. So I might look at this picture and say, hey, tell me about this picture. And then I'll put the who card down, and they might say the kids. And then I'll put the what doing card down, are looking at a bike. And then I might put the where card down in the shop window, which is exactly what's happening in this picture. The kids are looking at a bike in the shop window. That's kind of the main idea of this picture. If you don't have these cue cards out and you say, hey, tell me about this picture, because our kids are very detail focused, they might say like, oh, there's ABC blocks. You say, oh yeah, those are ABC blocks. And then you could work on building comments and you could say, oh, there's 3 of them. But then I might say, well, let's look at the whole picture. Let's make sure we're seeing everything in the picture so we can get the main idea. So by working on getting the gist or the main idea, you're helping kids see more information rather than zooming in just on the teeny tiny details. And you can also, when you're looking at books, work on early perspective taking. So you can work on like, hey, what is that girl looking at? Oh, let's draw a line. Oh, she's looking at the bike. And then you might say, what is she thinking about? Well, if she's looking at the bike, she must be thinking about the bike. And then you can ask, what could she be thinking? And then I even use sometimes just Post-it notes, and we'll draw a little thought bubble, and we'll try and guess what somebody is thinking based on what they're looking at. So she might be thinking, I want that bike, right? So that's very early kind of perspective taking and understanding that what you think might be different than what other people are thinking. And you're working on the importance of understanding and following the eye contact of another person, because that can give you a lot of information about what they might be thinking about. Also using books, you can work on prediction. So what do you think is going to happen next? And oftentimes a child will say, I don't know. And then I'll ask, well, what would you do if you saw a bike in the window? And then I'm more likely to get a response if they can pull from their own experience. So they might say, oh, I'd want to go look at it, or I'd want to buy it, or I'd ride it. And I'd say, oh, that is a great idea. Let's turn the page and see if that's what the girl does. Right? So these are all things that you can do using books that work on expanding language, expanding communication, and understanding of higher level concepts like perspective taking and making smart guesses about the future and what's going to happen next. For older kids, barrier games can be a great way to improve how specific a child is with their language. So here's an example. They have a board between them so they can't see what's on the other side, and they have very specific toys that match. So this girl has created a scene with her toys, and she has to use her words to describe her scene so that this boy can match the scene. And then you lift the barrier and see if you guys match. You can do this with Legos. You can do this just with drawing on paper. I'm going to draw something so you can't see it. I'm going to describe it to see if you will draw the same thing. And then let's lift up the barrier and see if we match. Being very specific in our language use is something that is hard for autistic children, oftentimes because they don't have great perspective taking. They assume that you can see what they see. So they say, well, I want you to put this here and put that on top and then put this next to it. And you're thinking, I have no idea what you're talking about, because this and it and here doesn't mean anything if I can't see what you're seeing. So you need to use more descriptive language, more specific language, so that I can create the same picture as you. Telling silly stories, being able to sequence ideas and tell really good stories can be hard for our kids. These Rory story cubes are great. They have all these random pictures and you roll them and you can take turns using the pictures to create a story. Having your child explain to you how to play a game or how to cook a favorite item can be a great way to get them to expand their language and recognize that they need to be really specific about how they use words. And then, of course, we always want to acknowledge and respond any attempt that a child makes to communicate. So even if you don't understand everything that they're saying, you want to acknowledge that you appreciate their attempt. So, hey, thank you so much for telling me. I can see you're really working hard to explain this to me, and I appreciate that. Because communication is hard for our kids. It's going to be difficult. It's one of the foundational kind of components to having a diagnosis of autism is your child is going to have some level of challenge in communication. Could be very severe, could be very subtle, but language is going to be harder for them. So we want to acknowledge any attempts that they actually are making to use it. We're going to go through this pretty quick, but oftentimes I get parents asking or telling me, my child won't tell me what they did at school today. So just a quick suggestion. What did you do at school today is a very broad, open-ended question with an infinite number of answers, right? There are a million things that happen at school today, very, very small things and very big things. It can be overwhelming for a child who doesn't understand what you're really asking. You're not asking for your child to tell you the million things that happened. You're asking your child to really come up with like one or two interesting or different things that happened today. That's what this question really means. That's the hidden meaning behind what did you do at school today? But for our kids who are very concrete thinkers, not very flexible in thinking, they don't recognize that. So you need to be more specific as a parent in how you ask your question. So instead, maybe try asking a narrower, more specific question, like tell me one thing you did today, which still could be very broad because the day is very long. So maybe you say, tell me one thing you did before lunch, or tell me one thing you did at recess. Tell me what book you read. So rather than asking this big open-ended broad question, make your question more specific and you're much more likely to get a response. You could also make it visual, have your child draw something that happened before lunch and then use that picture to describe to you what happened. Now we're at the tippy top of the triangle, social pragmatic language. We're going to fly through this. Social pragmatic language is how we communicate socially with other people. It's the unspoken rules of communication and conversation. It's what we say, how we say it, our body language, and understanding the perspectives of others. And it involves conversational turn-taking, introducing and staying on topic, asking questions, understanding body language and facial expressions, understanding that other people think differently than we do, and understanding and using humor. Those are just an example. Social pragmatic language is something that's going to be difficult for our children with autism. What I think are kind of good places to start with in terms of helping support conversation skills are to teach the parts of a conversation. So conversation consists of questions and comments. Those are the two things that we use in conversation. Questions are used to get information from other people, and comments are used to share information. An easy way to work on questions kind of early on, if your child's not using any questions, is to pass an object back and forth and pass a question. So I might say, what's your favorite color? The child answers, and then their job is to pass the question back to me. So pass the ball or the object back and ask that question back. What's your favorite color? And they'll say, oh, it's green. And then I might say, what's your favorite food? And they will say, oh, it's pizza. And I want them to pass it back. What's your favorite food? Oh, I like spaghetti, right? So that's just passing questions back and forth using an object as a visual reminder that you need to pass the question back and forth. Comments, here's just a visual I made of different comments you can make in conversation. So just providing a child with these comments of things that they can say. So if I said, oh, I really like spaghetti, then I might point to this chart to something like great or cool or yummy to remind the child that they can respond to what I've shared by making a comment. Or if it's something like, oh, yuck, like I don't like spaghetti, that could be okay too. But here's a visual way to remind children that we need to respond to what other people have said. For older, more advanced communicators, it can be very difficult for them to know what to talk about, what to ask questions about. So they may be able to ask all kinds of questions, but picking a topic for conversation is challenging. So for these kids, I give them the example of a topic mountain. So we talk about how lots of people, when they go hiking, can get to the bottom of a mountain, right? Everyone can get to the bottom. And when you're picking a topic of conversation, the topics at the bottom of the mountain are topics that everyone knows about, everyone can talk about. Some people are going to get to the middle of the mountain when they're hiking. And when you're thinking about topics of conversation, these are topics that some people can talk about or are interested in and other people aren't. And then only a few people are going to get to the top of the mountain. And if we're thinking about conversational topics, these are topics that not very many people are going to want to talk about, or have to be very specific people that you're choosing to talk to. And then I'll usually create a little worksheet, and we'll just go through this quickly. These are topics that kind of fit into each category. So bottom of the mountain topics that everyone knows about, could be weekends, movies, upcoming holidays, food, restaurants, weather, hobbies, travel, school, current events. So those are good topics to start any conversation with, to ask about. If you know a person pretty well, you could start by asking questions in the middle of the mountain. These are topics that some people know about or have experience with. So like video games, books, pets, music, concerts, sports, things like that. But not everyone's going to want to talk about this. So you might start at the bottom of the mountain and eventually kind of work your way up to the middle of the mountain. And then top of the mountain topics are topics that you need to be careful with. So these are topics like politics, religion, very, very specific topics like bullet trains or astrophysics or taxes. You generally don't start a conversation here at the top of the mountain. You start at the bottom and maybe work your way up depending on who you're talking to. Then there are these parking lot questions here, which are just automatic ways to start a conversation. So things like, how are you? How's it going? What's up? So even before you get to topic mountain, you might ask these questions and then jump to the bottom of the topic mountain. So, I can spend quite a lot of time having kids sort of fill in what they think belongs in each area of this topic mountain. But it can be really helpful for making it visual for children and how to pick a topic of conversation. And now I know we only have a couple more minutes. Thank you guys. We raced through it towards the end. These are some suggested picture books that are great and that I have used. There's many, many, many more, but I just wanted to provide this to you. So you'll have this in the PowerPoint. And since this presentation is recorded, you can go back and take a look at this list. But good place to start for using books to facilitate language. And here are some resources. that you might find helpful for facilitating language, both with younger kids and with older children. Socialthinking.com is a great website, has lots and lots of books and resources on the social development of language. So I highly recommend, if you haven't checked it out already, to go ahead and check that out. And thank you so much. Please, please, if you have any questions, email me at centertraining1, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. So thanks so much.